Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final day of this conference, and thanks to all of you for joining for this panel discussion, which promises to be a very exciting discussion given the vast experience that our panel brings with it. I would like to start by thanking each and every single one of our panelists for taking time to join, and I'm thankful to each one of you for being here. The theme of this particular panel is to talk about trends at technological cutting edge and leading big science. I think what I want to do as part of this particular panel is to touch upon some of the major topics such as digital transformation, leading big science, artificial intelligence, and many other technological challenges that affects major programs. Focusing also upon some key areas of interest such as digital transformation, artificial intelligence, energy, healthcare, space, water, sanitation, food security, IT, and the list goes on and on and on. But as we discuss this broad area, this broad theme, I hope as part of this panel discussion, we can basically have a discussion and learn from each other and understand what are the trends of innovation in cutting edge technologies. How would these technologies need to adapt over time, given that it feels like we are living in a world that is increasingly unpredictable? Be it climate change, we are having heat waves in India and Pakistan that were never seen before. We have the challenges of the pandemic, which is far from over. We have rising fuel prices, which is transforming into social unrest. We have an ongoing war in some part of the world. And we cannot talk about technological innovation and cutting edge without actually discussing these topics as well in that context. And in the midst of these challenges, the question then comes up is how do we translate these technological cutting edge innovation into practice for the ones that need it the most? And finally, while the development and translation and innovation is a major component of cutting edge technologies, the success actually depends on the acceptance and uptake by the masses. I cannot stop but think about the COVID-19 example, where we had the vaccination program, we had a very solid transportation, supply chain networks, but due to misinformation, miscommunication, lack of information, the uptake of these vaccines were not what they could have been. And I think the same needs to be discussed with technological cutting edge, that although we may have innovation, transformation, scalability, how do we communicate that? How do we ensure that the masses uptake these? Now, these are some big questions. We have limited time, but I cannot think of a better panel to discuss these with. So what I'm going to do now is introduce to you each and every single panel member. And I have to apologize in advance. Their experience is so vast, I cannot tell what they have done in detail in 5 minutes. But for any member of the audience who wants to know more about the panel, I believe the detailed bio is on the conference website. So the structure is going to be a bit like this. In the next 5 minutes or so, I will introduce each of the panel member going alphabetically. After that, I'll invite each panel member to make introductory remarks, comments, their views on this topic and about their own research. And once that is done, we'll have about 25-30 minutes for moderator-led Q&A. And at the end, we'll open the floor to the audience. And please feel free to post any comments, any questions in the chat, and we'll discuss it. So I would like to first introduce our panel member, Alexander, who is a fellow in management practice in information systems at the Saïd Business School. His research focuses on the challenges of managing projects, not only in the field of IT, but also in hard and soft infrastructure, energy, and mega events. He is involved in teaching and developing courses on project management, risk management, and systems thinking. At Oxford, Alexander teaches on the MSc for Major Program Management, MBA, and the MPP program, which is a leadership program for the top project managers in the UK civil service. Before joining Oxford, he worked at T-Mobile International and was a consultant with McKinsey's Business Technology Office in Dusseldorf and Chicago, where he advised clients on IT and operations issues. Alexander, this is by no means an exhaustive introduction, but I hope it covers some of it. And thanks again for taking the time to join us.
I think I can remember some of the points that you just mentioned, so that's always good. Yes, so thank you very much for having me here this afternoon, at least in our time zone in the UK. And yes, so it's great to be part of this panel, and you will see the other panel members shortly. So my role on this panel is slightly askew in the way that, well, I'm more about researching big science and what cutting-edge technologies do, particular of that field of major projects. So straddling probably a little bit that audience who come here and say, actually, I'm interested in major projects, and yeah, what does big technology and big science actually mean for my practice? And the way I see it, and sort of what the research that I'm currently doing shows, is that wherever you look, as in we have got key trends that really impact a lot of the operations, a lot of the projects that we are doing around climate change, carbon neutrality, or even greenhouse gas neutrality, around further digitization. And we're also seeing a lot more in the space of manufacturing. So actually the way we are creating things and the way we're innovating is changing rapidly. So whether it's sort of the classic configuration of value chain in any industry is up for grabs and under question. And I think that's sort of not something that is very far in the future, as you just said, and we have some recent examples and key complexities and uncertainty in the environment that constantly make us think about that. And so a lot of these things are already very much in the present, and it's sort of slowly unfolding how these trends will really shape sort of our medium-term future. And what I see, what most organizations are doing is then to slowly explore what that future could look like. And the interesting thing where these topics really well lent into the future of major projects question for the whole conference is that a lot of organizations are introducing or sort of using projects to translate that external change, those trends, into internal realities. And so we're seeing that sort of, hopefully that most people in the audience will relate to that there is an important translation function to be made for where it comes out of research and development. So very excited to be here, and hopefully going to explore more of these elements as I see them with the rest of the panel.
No, absolutely, Alexander. And I think the topics you mentioned tie in so well with the conference and the panel. And we eagerly look forward to hearing more from you, your perspective about organizations and what you define as big science and big events and the trends in future. And if it's okay, I'll quickly introduce the rest of the panel and come back to you for introductory remarks. But thanks again, Alexander. Thank you so much. Next, we have Professor Charlotte Deane, who is a professor of structural bioinformatics at the Department of Statistics at Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us. She is Chief Scientist of Biologics AI at Exscientia. I hope I pronounced it right. She is also a co-director of the Systems Approaches to Biomedical Research CDT, which she founded in 2009. She served on SAGE, very impressive, the UK's government scientific advisory group for emergencies during the COVID-19 pandemic, and acted as UK Research and Innovations COVID-19 Response Director. She was also the Deputy Executive Chair of the UK's EPSRC. At Oxford, Charlotte leads the Oxford Protein Informatics Group, who work on diverse problems across immunoinformatics, protein structure, and drug discovery, using statistics, AI, and computation to generate biological and medical insights. Charlotte is on several advisory boards and has consulted extensively with industry. So Charlotte brings in a very unique set of experience, again, as all of the panel members do, while she has worked with academics, industrial partners, and the government, working in healthcare, but also looking at interdisciplinary approaches based on computation and AI. Charlotte, thank you so much for joining in. I'm going to introduce next Professor Constantine Cucios, who is the director of the Institute of Biomedical Engineering at Oxford. Thanks for joining again. He was the first chair to be elected in biomedical engineering at Oxford in 2011. That's a big deal, by the way. He is the director of Oxford Center for Drug Delivery Devices and heads the Biomedical Ultrasonics Biotherapy and Biopharmaceuticals Lab in Oxford. Constantine received the UK's Institute of Acoustics Young Persons Award. He was elected as Secretary General of the International Society for Therapeutic Ultrasound and is a recipient of Fred Litzy and Bruce Lindsay Award, and was elected as the youngest ever Fellow of the Acoustical Society of America. And what is really impressive, along with all these list of achievements, is that he has been very active in translating his research into practice and has co-founded multiple spin-outs, OrganOx, Oxonics, and Orthoson Limited. And in 2017, he was awarded the Silver Medal of the UK's Royal Academy of Engineering for his contributions to the translation of medical technologies into clinical practice. So we have two heavyweights who are working in healthcare. We have Alexander, who has been working at the Saïd Business School and can bring in a more industrial perspective, which is amazing. And we have our next panelist, James Clarke, who is the managing partner of Clarke Capital Partners, a family office and investment firm headquartered in Utah. He founded and led online retailer ClearLink until it was acquired in 2011. James serves as the chair or director on the boards of various private and public companies in Houston. Charlotte, if you could mute, I think she would rejoin. And he has served as a trustee and board member on several universities, as well as regional and global nonprofit organizations. James is a governor-appointed trustee at Utah Valley University, where he serves as a vice chancellor of the board and audit committee chair. And more importantly, for me at least, he's an Oxford alumni. So James, thanks again for joining in, and thank you so much all for being here. And very briefly, my name is Siddharth Arora. I'm the departmental lecturer at the Saïd Business School. I'm also the program director of the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development. And I've been eagerly looking forward to this particular panel because the topic of discussion is very close to my heart. So my research over the last 10 years has been on telemedicine, using smartphones to diagnose Parkinson's, and emergency healthcare. So I think the topics we are discussing here are very close to our areas of interest. And I think what I'm going to do now is invite each panel member one by one to make any comments, any views, any feedback they may have for the audience, and discuss a bit about their work and their insights and how it ties with the topics we have for the panel today. So I'll go alphabetically. I'll start with Alexander, if that's okay. Floor to you.
Thank you. I think I already gave almost my opening remarks earlier, having misunderstood ever so slightly our directions that we've been given here. Sorry, Siddharth. Maybe just to add a few seconds before really handing it over to somebody else, so you don't hear too much of me. I think the sort of what I see when we're looking at these challenges, when technologies come online and the way, we often think of them as transformative things, and I think somebody recently put it very, very well, is that to really grasp that opportunity of these challenges, it's not about turning a kitten into a lion. So a lot of our audience who work in major programs will always think about, taking something that is a ready-made solution and putting that into practice and thinking about all the different barriers and difficulties of what that entails. But what I think is the really interesting thing is that great potential of not kitten to a lion, but more a caterpillar into a butterfly. So how can we make use of these emerging insights, of these emerging technologies as being truly transformative for organizations, for societies, and for economies at large? And I think that is really the interesting thing. And we do see a lot of different challenges out there, and you already highlighted some of those. And I always think, and to add to this COVID thing, a recent case study that I always like to think about in terms of the COVID-19 recent history is around the French COVID app, which was very solutionist and very coerced into the organization, very intransparent in terms of how the data were used, etc. And that created a lot of mistrust, that created a lot of, revolution, kind of not use of the app itself. So it's, even when technical benefits are clear, that kind of, we're talking about cutting edge technologies, but not from a solutionist perspective, but in this whole socio-technical nexus of the challenges we face there. And I think that's sort of the space that we need to explore. And that's also the space we need to get better at exploring and making our case. And I think that's all I want to say for now.
And that is super useful to have your insights on. And I'm sure COVID will be an issue that we'll be discussing as part of the topics that we discuss, given our shared interest in healthcare as well. If it's okay, I'm going to request Professor Charlotte Deane now to make any introductory remarks or views, comments you may have.
Hello. I think probably I want to talk about two things, thinking about the introductory remarks. First, coming kind of from my current life, where I'm an academic in Oxford and also working within a company within Exscientia. So Exscientia, for those of you who probably haven't heard of it, is a biotech with about 400 odd people in it, working to use kind of machine learning and AI to speed up the discovery of drugs. And there, I think you have the two sides of the challenge that Alexander just mentioned. The one is that ready-made solution. So lots of the things that you need to do that actually exist, but they need to be engineered into practice. But the much more exciting part of that are the things of actually developing stuff that doesn't exist and completely changing the way you do something. So one of the things that I feel quite strongly about in terms of thinking about AI or machine learning in these areas, but lots of these technologies, it isn't just like it's plug and play into the world we currently have. It might be totally changing the way we look at it. So if you think about in the kinds of things I do, the design process for a drug, you don't want to follow the previous pathway that people used for doing this and just plug little bits of new ideas along the way. I want to cross that entire pathway out and write it again from scratch and think about it like that. And many of the major advantages we'll get from these things need to be done like that. But that kind of big change isn't just difficult in terms of acceptance in a general population. That's difficult in terms of acceptance, just people thinking that way and totally changing structures. And then the second thing I should probably talk about a little bit, which kind of broadens it out a bit, is, as you mentioned, until January this year, from March 2020 until January this year, I was UKRI's COVID-19 response director. What that meant I was doing was I was kind of looking after and developing the processes and going to all the meetings and getting the funding for people to kick off research into COVID-19, both public research in the universities and also companies through Innovate UK. Now, once research was large enough, we were handing it on. So a really good example of this, mentioned already, is the vaccine, where we gave them very initial seed funding to get them going, or the recovery trial. And then we handed on the successful projects, quite often to government departments, to pump in much, much larger sums of money to actually get that to work. But the thing about that was, it isn't all about healthcare when you start talking about that. Many of the things that we discussed in terms of projects, and a lot of what we talked about, is, yes, you need the healthcare solutions within this, but to make them work or to actually have something that's useful, there are all the other pieces that go around that. But it is also that thing about the big jumps and advances and the interdisciplinary nature of them. So one of the things that, one of the most interesting meetings I was at was where I had to try and drag together a set of people who had quite literally never spoken to one another before, but were all, I would say, absolutely brilliant in their own right. I needed someone who was an expert in airflow in buildings, so an engineer who did airflow in buildings. I needed someone who understood what's called small-scale epidemiological modeling, so modeling when you only have, if you like, people in a building rather than modeling in a population size, and somebody who understood how to culture live virus and could deal with live virus. Because if we wanted to understand the transmission of COVID, that was the minimal set of expertise you needed. But those are not people who traditionally work together in any sense. They just don't do that kind of work. And so the other thing I've always felt about these kind of, really getting these big projects, it's not just, the brilliant people who do it, but that kind of giant, it's not even has to be a huge consortium, but really getting that true interdisciplinary nature and appreciating that. And then we discovered I hadn't got it completely right. It's not a big surprise. But we also then had to find some behavioral scientists to join the group as well, because actually nobody in that group understood how people moved around a building. So how humans actually use a building is another problem again, if you're trying to work out how you do this. And I will be honest, we actually added several more experts through time as we tried to build the project to understand transmission. So that's just one example, but we had multiple examples of this in terms of building in expertise from many, many different areas to really take technology from where it is now to be able to answer those kinds of questions. And so I think that's one of the big things around this area. But I think I'll stop there and let the others have their say as well. So thank you.
Charlotte, that was brilliant. And just listening to you was inspiring in so many ways, because we keep hearing about the need for interdisciplinary research. And people think, is it really required? And I think COVID-19 showed how important that is and what impact it can have. Listening to you have so many questions, but all I'll say is I think you were super humble saying that you didn't get it completely right. I think no one was expecting that either, but you got it right enough to make the difference that we have today. So thank you again. I'll come back to more questions once we have the introductions done. I would like to invite next Professor Constantine Cucios for any introductory remarks. Over this stage to you.
Thank you very much, Siddharth, and thank you very much, Daniel, for having me on this panel today. I'm humbled to be here. As you eloquently presented in your introduction, my primary expertise resides in the clinical translation and adoption of novel, complex medical devices and interventions, I've had the opportunity to do this 3 times in 3 different fields, on university-based research translating into small companies, once in organ preservation, working alongside Peter Friend, developing a new way to keep organs alive prior to transplant. A second, working with 2 other co-founders in oncology, in actually how we can maximize the impact of existing cancer drugs and future cancer drugs by enabling them to reach their targets better. And the most recent endeavor is in trying to deal with not only the symptoms, but also the cause of lower back pain by devising a minimally invasive intervention. These are very different things, and you will garner from this CV that I enjoy the thought process and the expertise much more than working on the same thing for more than 5 years. And I think the main thing that qualifies me to contribute to such a general panel is actually trying to distill and identify the common denominators and the common problematics and the common thought processes that arise from these types of endeavors. Academically, you very kindly said that I had served as a director of the Oxford Centre for Drug Delivery Devices. This was a major EPSRC program grant of about £11 million, cutting across academia and industry. And like Charlotte, the main purpose of it was to bring together under an academic umbrella communities of people who speak completely different languages, namely the pharmaceutical and oncology companies on the one hand, primarily chemists and biologists, and the medical device companies on the other hand, primarily engineers, physicists, and surgeons. The most recent endeavor, though, which I think is perhaps aligned to this panel, is my role as founding director of the Podium Institute for Youth Sports Medicine and Technology, which was a very recent and very generous £25 million donation by a charity started by Ron Dennis, the founder of McLaren, to create the world's first institute exclusively focused on safety in sport rather than performance, and particularly safety in youth sport. And I think, again, you'll hear me draw on that in my opening remarks, because I think it's very interesting that someone has decided to devote such a significant chunk of resource and effort to a problem that occurs early in life, but potentially has lifelong consequences for the individual and a lifelong burden on a very vast proportion of the population in later life and on the cost of healthcare. So I would like to maybe extract and distill only 3 points for the discussion today, cutting across these experiences. And the first is, future research in society almost always arises from the biggest challenges it is facing in that particular generation. I think we all know this, particularly those of us still within the university's pension scheme. One of the biggest challenges today is we all live longer and we remain healthier for much longer, until a point where we are no longer that healthy, and our costs of healthcare escalate dramatically and beyond anything the current system can withstand. So we have this tension of having access to more innovative and cross-disciplinary technologies than ever before, but having a greater need than ever to make them cost-effective from inception. So there is this fundamental tension between how do we deploy solutions to solve these problems, but how do we ingrain in our thinking, without stifling the science from a very early stage, the understanding that we need to capture the health economic aspects of whatever technology we are developing and build it into our thinking from day one. The second key point, which I would like to extract, which I think will cut across a number of our fields, is data. Boy, do we have data. Do we have more data than ever before? We have so much data, we can't build storage facilities and GPU clusters fast enough in order to deal with the volume of data that is coming in. But at the same time, we have greater privacy and data usage concerns than we've ever had before, which means in an era where it would be tempting to say, let's do everything and anything we can with that data if we can ever muster the technological capability to do it, we also have to put in place checks and balances and safeguards to respect the right of choice of the individuals. And that is a second major innovation and translation challenge that we need to address. The third is from the point of view of actually getting innovation to patients. We are rightly more risk averse as a society than ever before. We expect everything to be properly investigated, regulated. And what that has done is that it has actually lengthened both the time and cost for a discovery to get from lab to patient. When I started working in this field for interventions, there was a reasonable chance of getting something done in 5 to 7 years. I would argue that if I look across the portfolio more recently, that time scale has easily grown to beyond a decade. And so there is this third tension that we have this growing healthcare and societal problem that could be addressed with technology and intelligent scientific solutions. But our societal approach to risk and what we are willing to accept as evidence are creating a tension between how quickly we can take that invention and put it to good use in society. And I will leave you with those initial thoughts.
Those initial thoughts are so valid thoughts. Constantine, I cannot agree with you more. Those are also such heavy thoughts that I cannot help but come back to them later. Each one of them. Be it going from the current problems to the future problems around the data, the privacy, the volume, the storage, the GPU, and the third problem that you mentioned, which is getting the innovation to patients in a timely, cost-effective manner. Those are all very important points, and I'll come back to that for the whole panel. Thanks again, Constantine, for your thoughts. And I'll now invite James to share his views and comments. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you very much, Alex, Charlotte, Constantine, for your remarks also. I appreciate that. I think I'll also make sure that you note that I'm the only on this panel, only person on the panel that doesn't have a professor title in front of their name. So you're hearing from the least of these. However, I'm very proud to be a part of this NPM community. And as a proud alumnus, of course, graduating in 2012, grateful for what I've learned from those who studied under, like Alex, and the opportunity we've been able to use and leverage within our firm, and what I do also in nonprofit, sort of these principles and concepts and constructs that we've been able to discuss as members of this field. Naturally, the reason I entered the cohort as I did was I wasn't a traditional sort of practitioner of major programs or managing major programs. My thinking behind that was I'm a person who throughout my career has sort of taken, X number of dollars and tried to create enterprise value around a business. And that had primarily been around big data or big science initiatives that would, of course, result in what we hoped would be a company. And so, and sort of the tagline that's used to sometimes describe our firm here at Clarke Capital is we take millions and turn that into billions. And we've done that now several times over within our organizations. We're not successful if we're not able to do that. So we don't start with this $1 billion budget that says, here is what, a defined outcome looks like for you. Ours is we're going to invent a company around a certain problem we see in the market, leveraging these same principles. And if you're successful, then you yield and end up with an enterprise value of billions of dollars. And that's been our hope. And we've seen great successes over the last dozen years as we've done that professionally here. And since, in the last decade, since I've been part of this program and this community, but also in the last, 25 or 30 years of my career, as we've been building businesses. I'll just touch on a couple. And by the way, also as we do that in higher education, as I serve as chair of the board of the largest university here in our state, in Utah. And some of you may have heard of Silicon Slopes and the exciting technology that's taking place here. It's known, the state of Utah is known as the fastest growing and #1 economy per capita in the United States right now. It also means that our inflation is higher than any place else in America. So we've got our challenges there, but it's been really wonderful to see this sort of what was maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, sort of this nascent sort of data science and technology community and even life science community grow up. And so it's been fascinating for us to participate in several of these companies that have helped in this economic growth and sort of planting our flag, if you will, globally as to how we operate. But an example of something that we did, and all of you will remember, because you're users of Amazon, this one-click button invention that was invented, it was patented in 1997. I mean, it was for me as an online retailer was revolutionary in so many ways. And you watch the stock of this company that came out at less than $1 billion of enterprise value, and today is an over $1 trillion company. That's one of those great scientific inventions, even though it's overlooked oftentimes in commerce, that changed the way that we do business. One click and we're able to, see something land on our doorstep. And in a large part, that's what we've tried to do, is hit this easy button, if you will, within our organizations as practitioners to help solve real problems, from companies within our own portfolio that deliver things that might save lives, but also could make lives a little simpler for us. And one example of what we've done there is a company called Contour. It was a camera company. You probably have never even heard of that, but certainly you've heard of GoPro. They were our key competitor in the marketplace. And we thought one of the distinct advantages that we could bring to a market like that, where there was fierce competition, we were creating a category. This is what I largely spent my time writing my dissertation about, is category creation and how to build enterprise value that way. But there was no such thing at the time. So this is 12 years ago. There was no such thing as a device, if you will, a camera that connected to a smart device like your phone. So if you think about that today in the applications and where that is used, we invented this with several different patents that we developed. This was our scientific effort to sort of say, hey, let's make this very simple for people. If you've got an action camera or any camera, for example, a doorbell camera, or a drone or AR, VR, all these kinds of things, which we didn't think about as we were inventing this, but it's now leveraged in all of those areas and technologies. It becomes this very, very important invention that is used by several people simply to make lives easier. So connecting a smart device via dual streaming was something that was, at the time, incredibly novel for folks to sort of understand and see. In fact, we went to our vendor partners and our engineers and said, this is what we'd like to do. And they said, why in the world would you ever want to do something like that? Well, we said, well, we'll tell you. Let's invent this first. Let's work on it. We put it together, and that's what allowed then for you to stream into a device from a camera. And so those of you who have a Ring doorbell, those of you who have a drone, those of you who have a self-driving car, all these leverage the invention that was made so that we could make one's life easier in an action camera. And it becomes incredibly valuable that way. Now, it's not a $1 trillion invention, but certainly fits within the scope of what we're talking about in leading scientific discovery. May not save a life. I think we have cases where it may have when we talk about Ring doorbell and security cameras, the way that that's used. However, it's been a great way that we've been able to look at enhancing life as we know it. And that's, I think, the theme of our firm, that we're operators first, investors second, operating to lead change in big science and inventions. With that, I turn it back to you, Siddharth.
James, thanks a lot. I think you bring a very unique set of skills in here as well, where we can learn so much about your interactions with industry, and you also have collaborations with universities as well. So we'd like to hear more about how that partnership works and how do you take learnings from one and apply to the other. And I like the points you made about these new technologies, including the company for the camera that you spoke about. And I would like to learn a bit more as we go along as to how do you see the translation of these technologies into practice? And what were the key challenges that you faced coming from that expertise area? So I think what I'll do now is, first of all, thank you all so much for the introductory remarks. I was taking a few notes and I have some questions, and I'm pretty sure the audience will have as well at the end. So the first thing I thought a couple of you mentioned, which was quite interesting, is, Alexander, you mentioned that you cannot take ready-made challenges and solutions and then apply to some other context completely differently. And similar point was made by Charlotte, who said you can't plug and play. Sometimes you have to start from scratch. And it kind of ties in well with the first point that Constantine made about the problems you have today are the ones that drive the solutions today, but they may not be the same 10 years from now or 20 years from now, taking the pension example. So I think the first question I have for the panel is, why do you think that is the case? Why are people then taking shortcuts when it comes to technological advancements? Because we cannot ignore the underlying fundamental problem, which is access to funding. Charlotte, you and Constantine have been working closely with the EPSRC. I'm assuming Oxford makes it relatively easy, but still extremely tough. If you're coming from a university or industry which does not have access to those resources, what do you think would be the way forward? And how do you think this all ties in? How can we mitigate these problems around funding and avoiding people to stop using these plug and play strategies or tackle questions that are going to be valid even a few years from now?
I'll kick off a little bit and then let others jump in. I think the first part of this is quite often plug and play can be a good solution, but it's never going to give you it. It's a different set of things that you will try and solve when you do that. So I don't want to say you never want to do that. You might want to do it quite a lot of the time, but it isn't always going to be the answer. There are many cases where it's not. The funding situation is always really difficult because the reality is I sit in a very privileged position where, I have been lucky enough to be funded for a very long time to be able to do a great deal of different things. But even me, I'm continuously spending my life trying to work out ways to get more funding to be able to do more. And it's true across the board, certainly in an academic setting. And my experience with industry, which is much less than several of my colleagues on the panel, is it's very similar. It's an environment where you're continuously trying to work out how you can have enough money to really attempt to do new things, whilst also you must show that you're doing something useful along the way, or there is an output that can be seen within a reasonable length of time. And so the challenges around funding are, I think, always going to be there, in the sense that there's never enough money. And that's not kind of never enough money for me. There just isn't ever going to be enough money in the system if you think about the number of things that it's possible to do. So a lot of this is about thinking about how you target funding. And it is also about being able to describe the reasons to do something which are different in different arenas. It is perfectly acceptable as an academic to say, I'm going to do this because I just want to know if it's true. Whereas I've discovered when I say that inside the company, they're less interested in that sentence, and they want me to explain why it might actually, within the next year preferably, but they might give me a little bit longer, actually produce revenue in some way.
Yeah.
So a lot in funding, I think, is related to that kind of question. Sorry, I should let the other guys come in. No,
not at all, Charlotte. That was really entertaining and entertaining because it is so true. So I wouldn't certainly convey an impression of a research council's gravy train. I think even in a place like Oxford that is very good at gaining competitive funding on a per capita basis, it is, as you say, highly competitive. I think one of the really clever things we have in the UK, which I'm very proud of, is that we actually have a level of public support for the entire innovation pathway, from basic discovery with research councils to sort of translation with Innovate UK, to clinical trials with NIHR, to a variety of really well thought through government schemes like the former Biocatalyst, which I think was completely transformative. And that gives us a very good opportunity to thread a funding route from inception to adoption. I also want to dispel the myth that funding being limited is a bad thing. And this is one of my pet peeves, that let's imagine a society where everyone had all the money in the world they wanted to pursue whatever idea they wanted. A lot of these ideas require refinement at inception. So the fact that you have to defend them against some experts and refine them in the process, probably, if the system is working appropriately, makes them better ideas that are more likely to achieve their impact by the time they are funded. So there needs to be enough funding, but not so much that it's a free-for-all without peer review. I think that would be harmful. And then the final thing I will say, which is a piece of teamwork we did across the university in the last 3 years, something called a contracting with business review, is I think we need to get better at working across business and academia in order to accelerate impact. I think a lot of ink has been shed on why everyone wants this to happen. But I think the cartoon reality of this is, universities want to work with business for the funding, and businesses want to work with universities because they like the sort of, brand name of solid research attached to their marketing literature. And I think we have an obligation to look for ways to make that interaction more meaningful for both parties. So one of the things that this review, which was publicly launched only yesterday on the university's website, is trying to do is to simplify the models for working with industry and business as a way of aligning ourselves with what business needs out of R&D. And I think if we can do that, we can potentially find previously unexplored routes to get from concept to adoption a little bit faster.
Those are extremely valid points. I cannot agree with them more. James, I would just ask you if you had any opinion, because you have worked in both US and UK, in both industry and academics. And did you see any major difference that you think worked better in one place compared to the other?
Well, it's a loaded question, as you know. Can I just shift to the first question that I see here for just 1 second, because I think it plays very, very well into what you're asking. The question is, does the panel think that some developed economies are better able to better exploit technology than others, and if so, why? Yeah, I think you could look to an example. I talked a little bit about the Utah economy. I think it's one of those outliers in what takes place in technology and leading big science, but it wasn't always that way. I mean, we've seen ourselves as an underdog. I really like betting on these underdog economies, and those places that have seen themselves as underdogs. The key is to keep that same mentality throughout once you've seen some success. So we're now seeing success and these very large, technological advances coming through in this geography here, and the key is to stay hungry. And as Charlotte and Constantine are talking about, the push-pull in funding, just making sure that we, sort of are the best deal in each one of these opportunities that we possibly can be. That we're the best opportunity that's out there, sort of in, bang for the buck, if you will. Sometimes we say, those who know Utah will find this a little funny, that we're champagne taste and beer budget. Although, generally the predominant religion in the state of Utah doesn't allow for anyone to drink. So again, those are that's how we see ourselves. I think there's another economy globally that's a good example of that. If you've been to Tel Aviv and look at what Israel is doing in big science and in major programs, I think that's a great example of doing a lot with very little relative to budget. I think you're seeing great technology and advances there. I remember going to, it's probably a dozen or so years ago, maybe more. I think it was the launch of 4G. The first true launch of 4G, I would argue, came out of India. Our friends at Airtel, and one of my former classmates, Rajan Mittal, who was able to sort of jump over, 1G, 2G, 3G and go straight to 4G because that was sort of first generation for them and provided one of the best networks that was out there because they were able to simply jump to the very best available technology at the time. So there's some distinct advantages in developing in sort of clean sheet opportunities in these underdog economies, even though some, as in Israel, would probably be considered developed at this point, but India, a developing economy. So there are real advantages in clean sheet opportunities where you can look and say, okay, we can just go straight to the very, very best. Whereas, today in America, we're talking about 5G, and even those that have spent tens of billions of dollars in this project to make it happen, I think one of the great underdogs you're seeing is a relatively small player in the space in Dish Network, that they have spent now about $10 billion building out their 5G network. That's probably, if you really look at the data behind it, it's probably the best 5G network that's out there. It's their first. It's not a Verizon or T-Mobile or AT&T that's sort of trying to patch and part pieces in. They've gone clean sheet and they've stepped over it, and they have probably more bandwidth and more birds in the sky than anybody being able to deliver that. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for these underdogs, if you will, to really disrupt markets and come in and be the major players. And so I like that question. I think that's a great opportunity for many to exploit the technology in leading big science and big data.
James, I liked what you said. Champagne taste, beer budget.
That's us, BT.
You mentioned big data, you mentioned big science, and I think that ties in really well with one of the questions again in the chat here. And it says, is the term big alienating to some stakeholders, or is it just an apt descriptor?
Any takers on that one? I've spoken a lot.
I'm looking at Alexander.
Well, you always think about it as sort of a big science, right? As big dollars, big machines, particular sort of in the physics and so on. And you think of big stuff, big labs to bring all these people together. And I think also to the last point that James just so eloquently explored in Utah, when we're looking sort of more, say, for instance, in digital technologies, a lot of those barriers are falling away now. So because, some of the technological advances that are seemingly small, say, everything shifts to the cloud. So these days, the only thing that's needed to do great research is kind of bandwidth. And then the other big thing, and that's probably the biggest bottleneck of them all, is great capability people. So you do see very much, say, in China, for instance, where we looked at some of the things and how the Chinese economy has really started through major projects and major initiatives. Right? In China, if there's a will, first thing that happens is university. The enabling factors in terms of tech and facilities and all that kind of stuff, that just follows. So that's not really an entry barrier to these things anymore. And I think it's really something, of course, big universities, old universities have that established brand name and probably have a little bit of an advantage there. But actually a lot of those classical barriers that used to exist, why others couldn't catch up, leapfrog even, those are really sort of overcome, at least from a technological hurdle. So I think it comes back to Charlotte's point earlier around that kind of, bringing together the right people and bringing together high quality people. That sort of is the big challenge, really. And what you're saying is, okay, is that big challenge always very expensive? Because that's kind of actually really what should be, increasing the fear factor, particularly when we're looking into organizations, is that's probably not true. So we see more open, less captive forms of innovation when commercial enterprises adopt innovation. So working through informal networks rather than owning all of these things and therefore expending a lot of capital. That's one of those things. And say, if you're looking into the medical device industry, if you look into hospitals and how they transform to a digital future, it's all through sort of small scale, lightweight innovations. That seems to be the predominant path, particularly in sort of less rich economies. Let's put it that way.
That's very useful, Alexander. I found it interesting you mentioned medical devices and you mentioned big data. And I think this again kind of ties in with some of the points that's been raised so far. Constantine said, with big data, you have a lot of potential issues around privacy and storage going forward in time. And we don't really have strong regulations in terms of privacy and data in a vast number of countries currently. So that's one aspect. And it again ties in with the point that James made about that camera. And I can easily understand if you have such cameras along the street and you have AI for image recognition, then there's so much damage that can be done with it as well. So I think my next question to the panel is, we can't really talk about technological advancements and not talk about the data that drives it in some way, and the privacy issues around it. So where do you think we need to go with that front in terms of regulation without actually delaying the whole process, which ties into, again, Constantine's point about the whole process sometimes being so dragged, not only because of data, but the ethics, the validation, the devices, the risk-taking capability, so that we do things in check. It's all validated. The protocols are there for not only data privacy issues, but also model validation. But at the same time, we don't overdo it to the extent that by the time the device is out in 10 years' time, the problem it was designed for no longer exists.
So I'll comment briefly because I think I want to put something in there as well. In not all areas are we data rich at all. And in not all areas do you actually need to be incredibly data rich to make use of many of these things. So it's a bit like the use of the word big. You can have things where you need very small amounts of data, which can power incredibly powerful change as well. And in many areas, we are actually data poor to be able to do things. So in the area of drug discovery, surprisingly enough, for many of the questions are actually data poor rather than data rich. I think the issues around the kind of privacy concerns and ethics, I think I better hand on to others. But I did want to say, I think there are differences here in terms of the data, that it isn't always as nice and clear cut when people go, we have giant data sets. Lots of areas we don't have giant data sets at all, but also in many areas that doesn't matter. You can do an awful lot with much less.
Thanks, Charlotte. Anyone else wants to chip in?
I just want to maybe take half a click back to the question that was asked about which countries are better or more efficient at innovating. By the way, I think Charlotte is absolutely right. We do not have data or the right data for everything. I think what I was trying to say is we're able to acquire it at a phenomenal rate. The only thing we can't yet control is time. So if you need 20-year outcome data on patients, it is going to take 20 years. But I certainly didn't mean to say we have data on everything. In terms of which territories are best at innovating, I think we have to look. The problem is every area approaches innovation with tunnel vision. So the researchers worry about how they can translate their inventions into a company and into clinical practice. Governments worry about projecting the impression of an ecosystem that greatly enhances innovation. Reimbursers and payers worry about paying as little as possible for the possible interventions. And all of these things, depending on which country and which territory you look at, are remarkably disjoint. I'll give you a very specific example here in the UK from my experience with my first company. A fantastic supporter of it has been NHSBT, which stands for Blood and Transplant, which is a separate service directly funded by a separate budget line that looks at technologies for organ transplantation and organ utilization. That is actually a separate budget to the NHS. And so one of the things on this journey I was astounded to discover is that neither body really cared about saving the other money, even though it's actually the same healthcare system, because they came out of separate budget lines. If you could demonstrate that an intervention saved 20,000 patients a year and reduced their cost of care by 40%, because that happened further down in life and therefore was going to come out of a different purse, the people who were making the decision at the precise moment in time were less interested. And by the way, these things exist everywhere. I'm by no means saying the UK is if anything, is significantly better than other parts of the world. We also need to look very carefully at how fit for purpose the current regulatory framework is for those innovations. So there's a really interesting difference between Europe and the US. Currently, for most of us, rightly or wrongly, the two primary initial target markets for new inventions. Europe has separated its notified body and its regulatory authority system. So we have, the national bodies that are responsible for safety, but they delegate that process to for-profit private organizations that actually drive the detail of the process in order to arrive at CE marking. The US has taken a much more centralized approach of the FDA doing everything. Neither of those systems is particularly well set up for highly cross-disciplinary research and inventions at the interfaces, which is where most of the discoveries are coming from. So all of these bodies are structured in devices, drugs, software. And the second you have, like most products and inventions do today, something that cuts across two or all three of those, there is no clear pathway to innovation. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I do think some countries are better at innovating than others. I think the UK does it very well and very cost effectively, could be doing it better. I think the US also in some ways, from the point of view of the regulatory processes, it's better. But I do think what we have to do in order to accelerate that process is look at it, and to pick up on something Charlotte said earlier, be prepared to rip it out and start again, asking ourselves the question, is what we have today developed over the last 30 years fit for the innovations and what patients need today?
It's a very valid and a very strong point. We have these innovations going in industry and academics, but we need the same level of innovation in the regulatory bodies which actually approve these innovations in the first place. And that's a fair point. And the fact that these regulatory bodies are different, very well defined, very well distinguished areas where they have medical devices for one division and drug for other and software for other and whatnot, makes no sense to me personally. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Do we have any more comments? So we have a question from the audience. Are the lessons learned in the COVID-19 pandemic applicable away for the extreme conditions?
Charlotte, over to you.
The answer to this question is many of them, in terms of things like funding, which is what I was thinking about, are yes. So one of the key things that I worked on inside the Research Council was to speed up the rate that we got money out the door. Anyone who's applied for an academic grant or even a grant from something like Innovate, so an industry grant from government, would find that it can take, and in fact frequently does take, 12 months from when you, if you like, submit your idea, being successful to actually having anyone in the door to do the work. And if you're in the middle of a global pandemic, 12 months is not an acceptable length of time for that to be. And in fact, 6 months isn't. And I spent a lot of my effort trying to work with my colleagues inside the councils. I mean, our first drumbeat was to get people information back on whether they were likely to be funded or not within 2 weeks. Now, we couldn't get, sometimes we even managed to get them the money within about 2 or 3 weeks. But to do that, you have to think very hard about the system. It's like a complete system change, because you cannot sit there and go, right, I need to wait for everybody to be ready, and I need everybody to have read this, and I need everybody to agree, because you can't do that in 2 weeks. You need to think very carefully about exactly what you want to achieve. You need to think carefully about who needs to have signed off on what, and exactly who has the, if you like, the right expertise to say that this is a project we want to get underway. So I think there is a lot to learn in terms of funding, not to go to such an extreme level as that, but about saying, actually, a year is a long time in research. An awful lot changes. An awful lot's changed in my field in a year. So delaying the start of a project by a year is something that is always going to hold back, if you like, advances coming quickly. Another thing about it, which I guess I've already mentioned, was the interdisciplinary nature of what happened. It's always been blindingly obvious to me, and maybe that's because I've always worked at the interface basically between sort of medicine, chemistry, biology, computation, mathematics, statistics, computing, that it's important to work with people who do different things from what you do and think differently from you. And that is both in terms of the kind of be able to do a piece of research that's really important, but also in terms of the way you approach a problem is different. You know, I approach a problem from a very statistical, mathematical point of view, because that's how I'm trained. But if I work with someone from medicine, even if they might come up with the same solution, they would approach it from a very different way because their training and background makes them do that. So actually, you come up with a much more well-rounded solution if you do that. And the pandemic just showed in spades how important that was, to come up and behave like that, and just to be ready to listen to people from all of those fields and to realize that they had really cool solutions. You know, a solution that turned out to be incredibly important, some of you might have seen this, was something that came in quite early in our list of kind of, do you want to fund this thing? So a project that was unsolicited, came in from the research community about measuring how much virus there was in wastewater. So academics had spent ages doing sort of small scale projects about measuring what was in wastewater. Turned out was very, very useful in the COVID pandemic to just be able to take samples of wastewater and work out how much COVID virus there might be in an area, because of course wastewater plants, and even more useful in countries where perhaps they couldn't do the kinds of testing we were doing here, and very useful in areas where you wouldn't normally, you know, where you had people who did not wish to participate in testing for whatever reason. And it gave you good early warning systems about where you might actually have a large number of people suffering. And those kinds of things was not something anyone had written on a list of, we should do this, but it required quite a lot of different people to come together to work out how you use that information, and then trying to explain that information sensibly to government as well. I would say that's something we haven't really touched on here, but a big part I learned from the pandemic was one of the key things here is explaining. So it's not just explaining at the academic industrial interface, but explaining to the public. I think, you know, in your opening remarks, you mentioned this a bit about you can fail spectacularly with any advance if the public sit there and go, I don't like that. Yep, because we have failed in our kind of duty to actually explain what it's for, what it does, how it works, why it matters, in a way that is digestible outside of our little bubble of happiness of, wow, we've done something cool. And that's even true when you talk about talking to government, because of course they're not necessarily stacked full of people who've learned epidemiological modeling for the last 8 years or cultured live virus in their lives. So I think those things around communication was something that I saw was so important, interdisciplinarity, and also speed. I think there are many others, but all those three, you could see how important they were, and you can, all of them, we could do more on and use some of the things we learned from the way things were done during the pandemic to do that. You could also argue about things like openness. Everybody told everybody their results really early, and that massively accelerated speed of being able to develop things like the vaccines and therapeutics. That instead of waiting to publish it and secretly going anti-genius, people, companies included, put out their data very, very quickly, and that made things go faster as well. I could talk about this for hours, so I should probably stop, but there is so much that I think we can learn from that.
Charlotte, that was extremely insightful. I cannot agree with you more on the points you made about the speed, the need for funding, the importance of interdisciplinary research, and most importantly, or equally importantly, communicating that effectively to the masses, to the population. And I think we have seen the impact of that with climate change initially. We saw it during the pandemic. We are seeing it now again with the Ukraine war. So all are super valid points. If I were just to have a follow-up on that question regarding COVID, and I find this quite interesting. So a lot of publications came out during the times of COVID. You had people applying machine learning, AI techniques, and you had a lot of models for prediction and prognosis of COVID-19. And that was my area of research as well. I was trying to forecast the risk of hospital admissions based on certain vital signs. And in a recent review, it was shown that nearly all publications on prediction models for COVID-19 in emergency departments had either a very high risk of bias or unclear risk of bias. So I think as we talk about these new technological challenges and innovations, I think quality is also equally important, and validation of these technologies before it's actually communicated. Moving on from that question, sorry, James, you had.
Well, I was just simply going to say, and listen, the data points are wonderful, and I'm so grateful that Charlotte would share, and there is so much that we've learned through this great experience of a global pandemic. I would caution all of us too, listen, I was in New York yesterday, I'm in Utah today, I'm talking to a global audience, of my colleagues and friends throughout the world and in Oxford. I want to remind us that in this process and all that we're doing throughout this invention process, throughout leading big science, big data, and all these projects, that it is a tactile sport, that it requires real relationships, and most real relationships can only be built by and through this tactile interaction. So much of what we do, especially in building teams. Now, can you manage a current team? Most probably, and we have. And that's what we've learned, through COVID. But so much of what we're doing requires this true interaction, person to person. Some of that can be done the way that we're doing that today, but so much of that is enhanced and better if we're able to do that in a tactile way. So that's the one thing that I caution my teams. We have about 36,000 employees that work for us globally, and I remind them often that there's so much of this that just comes by through interacting directly one-to-one. So we still try to focus on travel and being in the same room with one another and working and solving problems. I'm reminded, of course, the conversation that I had with our program director, Daniel, and Guy Ainsley as well, about us being known as the Swiss Army knives of all problem solving. The people can come to us as major program managers. We will be the leaders of solution-oriented projects and programs. And I think that's what we can be proud of. A lot of that comes through the relationships that we have and these relationships that we'll continue to build one-to-one.
And James, I'm glad you bring that point up, because it's so important that we have transparent communication across disciplines. And I hope this panel is a step in that direction, I have no doubt. Does anyone have any more comments before we move on to the next question? Okay, so the next question we have is from the audience. Science and research clusters seems to work, but there is a limited number of clusters that can exist, after which it becomes self-defeating. The best part about being moderator is I can pass on these questions to you.
I was about to say some research very early on when I did my doctorate inspired me. It was a very obscure book in sociology that basically traced the power of social networks, of exactly what James just said and what we heard so much about bringing like-minded people together. And this was the story that the classical composers, the Beethovens and Mozarts, they became great because their career really flourished once they've been to Vienna. So they had been in this cluster, and it was so important. It wasn't important how great your music was or anything like that, or at what age that happened to you, right? To Mozart, it happened when he was a little boy. To Beethoven, it happened much later in life. What really needed to be is you needed to make those network connections, talk to all these different people, get inspired from that, and from that, flourishing would follow. And I got just reminded of that in terms of, what are these clusters really for, right? Are these clusters driven because there's a lot of finance sloshing around? That's probably not a good reason, right? Are these clusters there because of history? We might see that change in the future. So those clusters used to exist because they brought a lot of differently thinking people together and get them talking. And I think that is what we see when we're looking at big science, is some of the great things that happen. And, in Oxford, we all know that the collegiate system is really great for that. And if you go down and look at CERN, the laboratory, in Switzerland and France, or a little bit of this in France. And one of the ground rules they have there is that if you go to lunch, you take the last space that is available. Same thing as in our Oxford colleges, right? Because that kind of forces that exchange of information, talking to somebody who's completely not your colleague, trying to crack the same problem with the same set of eyes. And that human element, I think, cannot be underestimated. And where we see these cluster strategies on the policy level fail is often where it's a Me Too cluster. Look, we also need to have an automotive clusters, or look, some others, let's just copy what is currently happening in Tel Aviv. Let's just copy what we see in Silicon Valley. That never really works. So there's a certain bottom up. It needs to emerge rather can be really planned down, top down at a policy level element to that.
Thanks a lot, Alexander. That was super helpful. I think we have 2 more questions, so if that's okay, I'll move on to the next question. Are there any frameworks for decision making that support the blank sheet approach to reimagining approaches and processes? How can we maximize opportunity and minimize risk? These are amazing questions. I'm so glad as a moderator to just read it out and mute myself and listen to the amazing answers from the panel.
I think I will try and make a start on this one. I suspect it may have been motivated in part about my comments about regulatory processes and the need to reimagine them. And yes, I think both the FDA and the Innovation Office of the MHRA, both of which I'm familiar with, have working parties that are looking at these blank sheet approaches. It's not completely a blank sheet in the sense that I think it's very important to start with some sort of user requirement specification, some sort of sense of realism of what the problem that isn't currently being addressed for end users, for industry, for inventors actually is. And that rejoins Charlotte's problem of the challenge of getting people to align behind a vision or agreeing what the problem is when you're trying to change things quickly and radically because you have to. So I think it hasn't been massively successful so far, and I think rather than thinking big and wanting to take a wrecking ball to everything at once, it's actually proven quite effective to come up with new pilot schemes and actually put them out and see what they achieve compared to the status quo. And good examples of these schemes are the breakthrough device designation program that was started by the FDA a couple of years ago. And also the very different regulatory response we saw, which Charlotte and others will be familiar with under the COVID pandemic, where a lot of the normal processes were either changed or accelerated, acknowledging that there was a public health. So I hope these are some of the learnings we can take away from the pandemic, in that if there is a need, we can find a way to do things safely, better, and faster. And I would argue that even without a pandemic, there is a need for us to do things safely, better, and faster. So let's take those learnings and apply them as if COVID was with us, as it still is every single day across other areas of science and technology.
Very useful. Thank you, Constantine. Any additional comments on that question? Anyone?
I was just going to agree with what Constantin said, because I would have said exactly the same thing, that I think one of the most exciting things here is to do the kind of pilot studies. Is a lot of what we were doing funding in COVID was actually giving out relatively small amounts of money because you want to start something. And this is something I have learned from, once again, I'm an academic, but I have learned a little bit from things I've done in industry. The kind of failure is not a bad thing, but you have to, it's like fail fast, try lots of really hard things, because if they weren't that hard, then they would all succeed, and then actually they're not that exciting. So this idea of piloting things, and that's where you can actually just say, right, we'll run this with a different structure. We'll try it with an entirely different regulatory framework. We'll try it with a different group of people. And lots of this will fail, but you're much more likely to be able to change the status quo by demonstrating in a pilot that it's the right way to go and playing that game, I think. So I completely agree with what Constantine said here.
Same here. Thanks, Charlotte. I think we're nearly out of time, but there's one last question. I'll just bring it up and then we have a close. There are examples of personal data being shared with big tech without consent and sometimes in illegal ways. Is the control framework up to the job, or does it need a rethink?
I absolutely believe it needs a rethink, but that's a tough one. I don't want to touch the question because I don't have an answer, and I hate to deal on half-baked ideas. But I certainly wouldn't pretend that I have an answer for that one right now. But I do believe that we need to rethink this one, reimagine the best ways of leveraging, as both consumers and operators of these projects or companies, if you will. Yeah, you're right in asking the question, but this is a tough topic because we're used to getting everything for free. Well, how does the company then monetize this? So there's ethical, moral, and financial dilemma that folks are dealing with, but I don't have a great answer, but it absolutely requires rethink.
I'd like to give one word of reassurance to the person who asked this question. So there's a massive exercise ongoing at this very moment between the University of Oxford and the NHS on rethinking and redesigning precisely that. So the challenge we hit in an evolving era of science is, we said, patients provide consent for their data to be used for research. Therefore, everyone can have that data to do research, and therefore inevitably, as academic and industrial collaborations proliferated, some of that data found its way into essentially private hands. And so there's now been a sort of massive rethink of how do we police this in a more effective way without actually blocking innovation. And that is the current tension. So there are two steps that are being taken. The first is to make sure that the consents provided by patients, even if it is broad, the data is provided to a known party for a known purpose. And if that purpose then gets changed, there is a need to go back and request permission again. Now, that's going to make the policing better, but it's obviously going to make the innovation and the openness of what people can creatively do with data that much more difficult. It's not an easy problem, and it's not one we have a solution to, but there's a bunch of really, really clever people thinking about it right now. And I hope within a year or so, we'll have a template that can be rolled out as a pilot scheme.
Thank you so much for your views on that. I think we are up time-wise, and personally for me, and I can tell from the behalf of the audience, this has been excellent. And a massive thank you to each one of you, Alexander, Charlotte, Constantine, and James, for your views and insights. I'd been waiting for this panel for a few weeks, and it was completely worth it. Thanks to all of you mainly. And I would also like to take a minute to thank Daniel for arranging this conference and for inviting. I'm very thankful to the event coordinator, Lexi, who coordinated this call, and the AV team who have been working really hard behind the scenes to make this all possible. And at the end, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who is in the audience. I just want to let you know that I had my sheet of questions before this event with the questions I thought I would ask, but the questions in the chat were so amazing that I didn't ask a single question from the list of questions I had beforehand. So thank you so much for being so engaging and for your amazing questions. And I hope you found it useful, and hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are. And thanks again to our panel for being here. Thank you.